If you have your Bibles, you're going to want to turn to Exodus, and you may want to pull out the sheet for notes in your worship folder, and you're going to want to turn to Exodus 7. More or less, we're going to be in a lot of places, kind of, but that's where we're technically starting. A friend of mine texted me earlier this week and asked what I was planning to talk about on Easter. And I just texted him back real quick. I didn't have a lot of time. I just said that I'd be speaking about the Exodus. And his reply came quickly. Like all of Exodus with all the brutal parts and everything. My friend self-describes himself as an atheist, and we talk about everything from faith, history, politics, science, and the Bible. And we have these conversations at least once or twice a month. And often, as much as I hope that he gains some insight on our faith and on who God is from our conversations, he often provides me perspectives and insights that I need the longer that I walk with Jesus. When I think about the book of Exodus, my mind goes to deliverance. I think of salvation when I think of Exodus. I think of God's definitive act of rescuing his enslaved people. I think of God beating back the bully and setting the people free. I think these are good things to think when we think about Exodus. When my friend thinks about Exodus, he thinks about violence. More than that, he sees in Exodus a violent God who is, in his mind, the real bully in the story. Right? Because not only is God incomparably stronger than Pharaoh, the king in our story, but when Pharaoh seems like he's ready to call it quits, to tap out, God seems to kick him while he's down, twisting Pharaoh's will in order to bring further pain and suffering as the story goes. So my friend causes me to wonder, are these also good things to think when we think about Exodus? Right? Is God a faithful rescuer? Or is he a malicious tyrant? Is God a protective father? Or is he a kid with a magnifying glass over an anthill? Who is the God of Exodus? And what does he do? This is the question I want to consider this morning, and I hope to do so in a way that's honest with the text that we've been given, that both acknowledges what God does, but that also tries to make some sort of sense of why he does what he does. Officially, this morning, our passage begins in chapter 7, verse 8, and goes through the end of chapter 10. But unofficially, our passage reaches both backwards and stretches out forward. And we technically pick up where Derek left off 2 weeks ago, at the bush that burned without being consumed. There, God told Moses 3 things. God told Moses what he wanted Moses to go do. He told Moses his name to carry with him when he went to do what he wanted him to do. And God told Moses what he was going to accomplish through Moses when Moses did what God wanted him to do. Our passage then also reaches forward to the time when God is done in Egypt, and when there is no confusion about who this God is and what he is capable of. God is one who does what he says. And at the bush, he says to Moses, I promise that I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites. But I know this, that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a strong hand. And so I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all of the wonders that I will do in it. After that, he will let you go. This is the conflict that drives our passage this morning. God has sent Moses to confront Pharaoh. But Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, will not release the people until he has been thoroughly compelled to do so. God intends to compel Pharaoh to do so. Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, has and will continue to set himself against God. But what does this mean, and why is it such a big deal as we think about the way that Exodus begins to unfold? See, Pharaoh isn't the first, and he certainly won't be the last enemy of God, person to come and to set himself in opposition to God. He certainly isn't the first, and he won't be the last ruler to afflict God's people in some way. I wish this morning that we could spend more time talking about each of the individual plagues, but before we really can get there, we just need to be clear about Pharaoh. Thankfully, you're already at least somewhat familiar with them as you've been reading the plague account this week in the daily worship guide. And then in the Exodus reading plan that we have, you will have a chance to read through these 3 more times and get a chance to discuss them in a small group. And you'll notice along the way the features and the characteristics of these signs called plagues. But I think the plagues really are put into perspective by looking at Pharaoh. When God begins to plague Egypt, it isn't for a lack of warning. It's not just a knee-jerk reaction. Rather, the plagues begin only after Pharaoh proves God's prediction that, as God said, the king of Egypt will not let Israel go unless compelled by a strong hand. Before the plagues, when Moses and his brother Aaron confront Pharaoh for the very first time, Moses has already met with God, and now he's come to Egypt, and he's got his brother as his right-hand man, and there they are in front of Pharaoh. Pharaoh's response is revealing, and it says something about him and who he is. In chapter 5, verse 1, like I said, we're a little bit before our actual passage. We hear Pharaoh ask this question: who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord. Moreover, I will not let Israel go. There are 2 things that seem to be happening here that play themselves out through the rest of the plagues. The first is that Pharaoh literally has no idea who the Lord is. And the second is that Pharaoh's resistance that then comes when he's faced with not knowing who the Lord is. So I want to consider the first point for just a minute. Pharaoh asks who the Lord is. And he asks why he should do anything the Lord says. And he makes the point explicit. He says, I do not know who the Lord is. Or I do not know the one that you call Lord. Because he doesn't, it seems. Because thus far in the story, God has been making himself known to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. It is their descendants then, the people of Israel, who are to make the Lord known. And the evidence suggests that though Israel probably hasn't forgotten the Lord entirely, they haven't forgotten the God of their fathers, they have at least reduced him to another God alongside the gods of Egypt. Pharaoh doesn't know the Lord because the king of a people with many gods, the Egyptians had many gods, don't tend to concern themselves with the local God of a slave people. Fine, Pharaoh doesn't know the Lord. But now that he's confronted by the Lord, it's clear that he has no interest in knowing the Lord from this point forward. And so the question is, what is this about? Like most polytheistic peoples, people who have multiple gods that they worship, Egypt had gods that were at work behind all of the important natural sources of their lives. There was a god behind the sun and the Nile, and certain animals all had gods associated with them who were understood to control them in some way. And so at one level, all of the plagues that come become an expression of judgment by the Lord against each of these gods, against Egypt's gods. And in chapter 12, God will actually say this is one of the points of the plagues. But at another level, these plagues will be judgment. They will judge the very heart of Egypt's religious beliefs. One commentator narrows our focus this way, and he says, the sun was of paramount importance in the culture of Egypt. It was regarded to these people as the first king of the land from whom all of the pharaohs were descended. So consider that for just a second, right? Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, is considered to be the son of the supreme Egyptian god. The commentator then continues, pharaohs were considered to be the sun god's successors on earth, and their rule was in the image of the reign of the sun. In chapter 9, verse 14, the Lord tells Moses to say to Pharaoh, and I paraphrase this, he basically says to Pharaoh, listen, I could have wiped you out, but I raised you up to show my power so that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. And the very next line, verse 17, says this, you are still exalting yourself against my people. The heart of the conflict in the story of the Exodus is not just that there's this bad guy who's doing bad things and God is the Superman who flies in coming to the rescue. The heart of the conflict is Pharaoh's heart. Pharaoh is a god. He is the visible representation of Egyptian life and faith. He is a god in Egypt who believes himself to be God. He is a God who is worshipped and served in Egypt as a God. He is a God who sets himself against the Lord, the God of Israel's fathers, Abraham's God, Isaac's God, and Jacob's God. And not only does Pharaoh not know the Lord, but it is clear that he is not interested in knowing the Lord. Because what does Pharaoh have to lose if he starts to suggest that this God, the Lord, the God of those Israelites, is a legitimate God, and so we should free them to go and to worship him? Everything. Pharaoh has everything to lose. When Pharaoh says, I do not know the Lord, he's in effect saying, the Lord you speak of is not worth knowing. Because if he was, I would already know him. And since I don't, please don't bother me with your local weak deity. In fact, while I'm at it, let me remind you who I am. And it's at that point, as the story continues, that Pharaoh increases the workload for his Israelite slaves, and it essentially begins to crush their spirits, crush their will to leave. And for a moment, the word that had come to the Israelites, that the God of their fathers had come to them, it had inspired them, and they were hopeful. But it turns out that they've been in Egypt far too long. They know, because they've lived in Egypt, who is really in control. They know who they can trust. Exodus is a story of a face-off between these two gods, the known God of Egypt and the unknown God of Israel. But as readers of Exodus, we know what we're reading as we make our way through this. When we encounter Pharaoh, we know that Pharaoh isn't a god. It's a story of a human with grandiose ideas about himself and his power and his authority. And it's the story of the God who created the heavens and the earth, who has chosen a people for himself and has promised to remain faithful to them. And so in this way, we come to the story, Pharaoh against God, and we realize this isn't a fair fight. And this is where my friend that I told you about earlier finds his sensibilities offended. Your God is a bully, he says, and a manipulative one at that. And here he's referring to the theme that makes its way through our passage, the Lord hardening Pharaoh's heart. Really this sort of central idea through this story. There are a number of ways that the story in Exodus sets Pharaoh and the Lord against each other. One of the ways is to talk about the strong hand of Pharaoh and to contrast that with the Lord's strong hand. Another way to set them in opposition to each other is to depict their ability to produce signs and wonders, to control nature, to control the created world. But the dominant motif that runs throughout this narrative is that of the will. Who does what he wants? Is it Pharaoh or is it the Lord? And what better way to answer this question than to look at the heart? Just briefly to note, it's important that the Bible tends to use the word heart a little differently than we do. We tend to think of the heart as the place where we feel things, right? The Bible talks about the bowels and the lower organs as the place where we feel things, right? So when you talk about feeling something in your gut, it's that the idea that it's kind of low in you. The Bible's idea of the heart, then, is typically closer to our understanding of what happens in our minds. Specifically, the heart is the place where we decide things. It's where our will is situated. From the outset of the story, Pharaoh and the Lord announce their wills. Their wills are clear. Pharaoh wills not to let the people go. And the Lord wills them to be free. The will is a matter of sovereignty. A God not only gets what he wills, but a God does what he wills. A God can't have his will corrupted by someone else, not if he is truly a God. And so this story becomes a story about a battle over Pharaoh's heart, the home of his will. Whether it's for creative storytelling or for some other purpose, the author introduces us to three different words that sort of get dropped in through this story that most of our, that if you have the ESV, all gets translated the same way, but they all involve Pharaoh's heart in different ways. And the first word is kasha, and it literally means to make hard. In chapter 7, verse 3, we hear God say, "I will make Pharaoh's heart hard." And this is, if you've read these stories, this is the phrase that you're most familiar with. It's also, this word is the most rare through the story. The second word, and you'll see these words listed in your notes, is hazak. And it literally means to make strong. In chapter 7, verse 13, the narrator tells us that Pharaoh had a strong heart. Because the subject of the verb is Pharaoh's heart, one translator said it this way: Pharaoh's heart remained firm. It's not as though Pharaoh is making his heart firm or God is making his heart firm. In that, his heart is firm, it remained firm. And one other translator tried to capture the idea, taking strong heart as an idiom that means Pharaoh was strong-willed. The third word, kabed, literally means to make heavy. Moses describes his mouth, his own mouth, and his tongue as heavy. And in that instance describes them as being unable to somehow be used by God. But in chapter 7, verse 14, we hear the Lord say of Pharaoh, his heart is heavy. He refuses to let the people go. One Messianic Jewish commentator describes this idiom by saying that to make something heavy is to weight it down such that it continues on its present course. And I'm not totally sure why the ESV translates all three of these terms with the same word. But like I said, as you make your way through here, every time they show up is hardened, even if it's one of these three variations. It seems to me that these different words add color and maybe some additional insight to what is happening in this critical area, namely Pharaoh's heart. So to give kind of a walkthrough of this story then, the way that it begins is God announcing from the very beginning, before Moses ever even comes face to face with Pharaoh, God says is, I will make Pharaoh's heart heavy. Another way to say it would be, I will weigh down Pharaoh's will. Soon after that, Moses and Aaron, they confront Pharaoh for the very first time, and they've been laughed out of the room. And the Lord meets Moses again. And then in chapter 7, verse 3, we hear the Lord reassuring Moses by telling him again, but using a different word, I will make Pharaoh's heart hard. And so from the very beginning, God has an intention about what he's going to do to Pharaoh. Moses and Aaron, then they come back to Pharaoh for round 2, and there Aaron performs an initial sign, throws his staff on the ground, becomes a snake, eats other snakes, staffs, picks it up, and it's over, it's good. But in 7:13, the narrator tells us that Pharaoh's heart remained strong. Just a verse later, the Lord gives Moses his next set of instructions, and the Lord in these words tells Moses that Pharaoh's heart is heavy. You can see how these words interplay, they interchange each appearance. In chapter 7, verse 20 then, in response to the blood in the Nile, the first of the 10 plagues, we're told that Pharaoh's heart remained strong. Moses and Aaron, they're not doing anything that Pharaoh's own magicians can't do. And so there's no reason for him to be convinced by these men. And so he presses forward. He stays the course. But the very next plague then brings a change to Pharaoh. Because Pharaoh, at this point, for the first time in the narrative, makes his own heart heavy. We see that chapter 8, verse 15. So this is interesting, right? Up until this point, we've been told that the Lord is going to make Pharaoh's heart heavy, but we haven't seen that happen. We've only been told that Pharaoh's heart starts heavy, that it stays heavy, and that now Pharaoh further weighs it against the Lord and against the Lord's people. Though the story starts with the ominous promise that God is going to affect Pharaoh's will, we've really only seen that the circumstances around Pharaoh's life and that Pharaoh himself will do are the only things that have affected his heart. But that quickly changes. The story progresses through the plagues. First the blood, and then the frogs, and then the gnats, and then the flies, and then the death of livestock, and then boils. And it's here at the end of the 6th plague that for the very first time in the story, the Lord is the one who is described as making Pharaoh's heart strong. But this still isn't the final word for Pharaoh. It seems that even when God has made your heart hard, you are still capable to some degree of doing the same. He continues to make his own heart heavy, to have a heart that remains firm. But then it is in chapter 10, verse 1, that God makes clear that he has entered into this process in a definitive way. I have made Pharaoh's heart heavy. Pharaoh, who in the face of complete destruction at this point in the story, cannot turn back. Pharaoh has a group of officials around him who the story says that their hearts have also been hardened. But they still, with hardened hearts, are able to see what lies ahead of them. They are still able to resist. Because a hardening of the heart is not necessarily a taking over of a person in their entirety, especially initially in this story, because they are able to resist. They've lost everything in the battle against Israel's God so far. At least they think. They might just walk away with their lives now if they just turn back. But Pharaoh cannot stop. He will not stop. Which is it? He will not or he cannot. Maybe both. Pharaoh seems at this point to demonstrate a complete inability to will himself in a new direction. And in doing so, he reveals that he is not the God that he thought he was. Whether he sees this or not, his officials around him see it. Isn't that often the case? That those around us are better able to see our delusions than we are. And they plead with him to turn back. I think my friend is on the right track here with his sensibilities, when his sensibilities are offended by God's invasion of Pharaoh's will. Maybe to a degree we're supposed to feel this way. Biblically, this action by God seems to run contrary to God's very own intentions in creation. Humans alone, through the days of creation, are given the freedom to will freely with God or without God. But it does need to be said that this event appears to be an exception to the biblical rule. God doesn't seem to interact with humans in this way often, or even occasionally. But this does seem to be a fairly isolated event. But perhaps as a one-time event in history, it is a powerful reminder of the offense that our God-sized delusions and the resulting oppression cause to God. And perhaps this story is necessary in Scripture as a reminder for all of us who would acknowledge the God of Israel, that we would remember that he alone is creator and that we are but the works of his hands. Not only made by him, but also brought out by him. And this should not only humble us, but it should cultivate an abiding trust. See, what we don't see in our passage yet, but we will in the weeks to come, it's going to be more and more clear. The Israelites are not yet convinced. They do not trust this God yet. Through these plagues, the Lord demonstrates that through Moses, he is able to assume almost complete control over the natural world. Water, food sources, comfort, and even light. God is able, as demonstrated in this story, to shut these things down and then restore them in such a way that Pharaoh and his magicians, they cannot even come close to imitating. And yet, we will learn that Israel remains enslaved to the idea that Pharaoh is their God, that Pharaoh is their provider, that Pharaoh is their protector. The rest of Exodus will be a long and a slow and a painful journey where we are forced to consider just how hard it is to suspend our trust in the gods of this world, the gods of our culture, the gods that we've trusted for most of our lives when we begin to acknowledge the God of Israel. Pharaoh, as king of Egypt, had everything to lose if he acknowledged the Lord. He just didn't know that he would lose everything by not acknowledging him. I wonder what it looks like for us to count the cost of acknowledging Israel's God, the Father of Jesus. Are our lives marked by trusting obedience to him, or by timid fear that he is not actually capable of providing for us? pleasing us or protecting us, or rooted in his greatest promise to us of raising us from the dead? Do we believe that God is able? I think this is a question that our text provokes for us today, or challenges us with this morning. And so what does it look like to begin to offer ourselves in trusting obedience to him?